Hello, welcome back for some history. I have a confession to make. I love learning things about the American Civil War. It is really the first subject I got into as a young child when I had to do a report on it in the second grade, and the fascination grew from there. It was a horrid and bloody conflict, but also one marked by cherished ideals such as freedom and bravery. Whenever I hear about it, there are constantly new stories every time I listen, new details to find out, and much more. So today I thought I'd cover a subject that doesn't get talked about as much as the great battles, the larger-than-life generals, and the moments of deep courage. Any war in history, from the Egyptians and Hittites to the Soviets and US and Afghanistan, costs money. Weapons need to be purchased, uniforms need to be created, and soldiers need to be fed. All of this costs money. And while in every conflict, there are raids and other actions where supplies are taken and not bought, this is not, with few exceptions, a really sustainable way to supply an army in 19th century America. I know, we'll talk about Sherman another time. But know that raids were more of a way to deprive the enemy of supplies so that they couldn't purchase them, rather than a great way of sustaining your own army. I'll explore some of the economic situations on both sides of the conflict. Today, we'll take a look at the South. The southern states of the Confederacy had fertile farm fields, swamps, and other areas rich in timber and other goods. It grew food and manufactured goods. But of course, the main business was cotton. And while American cotton was said to be king and made up about 2/3 of the world's supply at the time, the average price had been steadily falling over the first half of the 19th century. And while there was no set price as each plantation or regional group haggled over the payment, along with differences in quality and the general economics of a given market area, the average price ranged from 25 to 37 cents per pound in the early 1800s, which was roughly around $120 and $178 per bale, which is 480 pounds. This was due to the high production cost and intensity of labor. Slaves had to skillfully pick out seeds from the plant, and this took a long time. Slaves were beaten to go faster, but this could not work indefinitely, as a wounded slave would not be able to perform the task as quickly as a more healthy one. This was also coupled with a high European demand, especially the industrializing countries such as Great Britain. Then, the price was further compounded by the high cost of purchasing more slaves, the added cost of feeding and housing them, the slow growth rate and high soil nutritional demand of cotton planting and shipping. Growing cotton as a business was expensive to maintain, and costs were usually transferred to the consumers who were buying the cotton. But this changed with the cotton gin. As the cotton gin spread in popularity, by 1811 the price had dropped to $70 to $60 a bale. Of course, prices ebbed and flowed in successive decades with wars and financial booms and busts, as the US tried to establish itself as an independent economic power as it stretched westward. But by 1860, they dropped to around 10 to 12 cents per pound by the beginning of the war. Why did it drop? Well, established farmers grew larger as they acquired new land for more production. Also, new farmers and investors as well bought up land in order to join in on the profits. Since there were more farms growing cotton, there was an increased supply, driving the price down. But since everyone was producing more bales, they were still making a profit. This also in turn led to an increase in the slave trade. Importation of slaves legally stopped by 1808, but the internal slave trade and slave breeding practices increased dramatically, leading to more profits in slave markets as well. By 1860, Of the slaveholding population of the South, around 88% owned only 20 slaves or less. The other 12% owned the large plantations, like the ones we see in the movies, and were some of the wealthiest individuals in the US. These large plantation owners often needed to get help to manage the place. Some hired from white overseers at around $1,200 to $1,400 per year, or around $40,000 to $45,000 in today's money. By the 1860s, those figures would have been slightly higher, most likely averaging around $50,000 to $60,000 today. Good overseers were skilled at getting the most efficient work out of the slaves, and while this is still a starkly abhorrent event, former slave Francis Frederick mentioned in his autobiography, 50 Years in Slavery, that these were actually the most humane overseers due to their professional nature. This was not done out of any caring or emotional connection to the slaves, however. They understood that fear through implication of violence might get more work out of someone than actual violence would. But not every overseer was of the utmost professional nature. Planters naturally wanted their overseers to maximize profits, so many beat and whipped slaves mercilessly. Some to the point that even some planters fired the overseer due to making their slaves unfit for labor. To save on that expense, though, many plantation owners chose slaves that they already owned to be overseers, and threatened them with horrible torture if they didn't keep the other slaves in line. Frederick mentioned that these overseers tended to be more brutal and harsh for fear of being punished themselves, which led to more physical violence. There were many cases of families being made to flog other family members. But not every planter and overseer were the same, and different economic thinking might have factored into decisions based on the size of the plantation. There were often two schools of thought on slave labor, as pointed out by John Newton, a former slave captain and co-author of the song Amazing Grace. Whether to appoint them to moderate work, plenty of provision, and such treatment as might enable them to protract their lives to old age, or by rigorously straining their strength to the utmost, with little relaxation, hard fare, and hard usage, to wear them out before they became useless and unable to do service, and then buy new ones to fill up their places. There is no words for just how deplorable and terrible this institution was. But aside from the human costs, economic practices of plantations must have varied widely. There are few records of individual plantation expenses left for us to examine and effectively get a clear picture, but it can be surmised that poorer plantations with fewer slaves might have had less harsher treatment than rich plantations, as buying new slaves was a larger expense for them. This wouldn't mean that life for a slave on a smaller plantation wasn't terrible in its own right, and violence would have still been common. But hopefully, more evidence in the future can shed light on and if the treatment of slaves might have varied based on the financial situation of individual planters. Many planters with a plot of any size by 1860 were most likely making net profits of $2,000 to $15,000 after plantation expenses, depending on the size of the farm, which would be around $70,000 to $500,000 today annually. Considering the average paid laborer on a farm or factory in the whole US at the time made an average of $200 to $300 a year, or about $7,000 to $10,000 today, that was a lot of money. Now, this may not seem like that much considering Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, but how the US economy and money worked before the Civil War is a whole different documentary. But just trust me, it was a lot of money. However, as Robert Kiyosaki says, it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. And many plantation owners did not keep much. Luxuries, high living, and loan payments for more slaves, equipment, and land often drove down profits, with some recorded cases even being 2 to 3% of the initial net. If they weren't good at budgeting, found a good deal that they couldn't pass up, a luxury item they wanted to buy, or needed a new slave, a good hand could be worth $500 or even over $1,000 if they were particularly talented, which is tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. Planters might not have had the money at the time, so they'd take out loans to get investment capital immediately. You see, items like cotton and sugarcane take a very, very long time to grow, in some cases 6 to 9 months. Tobacco grew quickly, but it was not as sought after as cotton. This meant most planters only got paid once a year. To make up for this, they would make loans of their own, loaning out their slaves to others and supplement the plantation in other ways, such as producing simple goods to be sold in nearby towns. Planters, however, were not the only ones providing for the southern economy. There were other farmers of the yeoman subsistence variety. They would grow food for themselves and family first, and sell the small surplus, if there was one, and perform other handy tasks for others to supplement their income. Factory owners also existed, with around 20,000 locations, such as textiles and ironworks. But these were limited in the South, only having a few centers of industry, such as Richmond, Virginia, and Columbus, Georgia. The wealth of the agrarian economy incentivized more farm work than pursuing anything industrial. Factories in the South also used slave labor for the most part, but white artisans did come in to design and manage details for the factories. Slaves were either owned by the factory owner or loaned out to them by nearby plantation owners, who probably wanted their slaves to learn some new valuable skills, which would either help the plantation out or make the slave more valuable if sold later. Because of all this, there was very little immigration to the South, as immigrants were drawn to the more numerous economic opportunities of the North. Exports from factories and plantations totaled around $255 million for the South annually by 1860, or just over $7 billion today. The main exports were cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco, with smaller amounts and a largely internal trade of produce, meat, slaves, and finished materials. The main ways to transport all of this was by ship, up and down the rivers and coastline, and by the few rail systems. This was the South before the conflict started. After the firing on Fort Sumter, the states were at war. Armies needed to be mobilized, supplied, and paid. The Confederate military was no different. A private signing up to the army could expect to be paid around $11 a month, or $340 today. By the end of the war, this was increased to $18. A regular sergeant could expect $17 a month, and a brigadier general could make $300, or over $9,000 today. Promotion regulations were much easier to push through in the Southern Army than their northern counterparts. But pay was received every 6 to 8 weeks, or worse in times of moving armies and chaotic battles. Many times, soldiers were fighting with what amounted to more of a promise of payment, with long intervals between actually being paid. This was not helped by progressing losses of rail lines and waterways, especially after the summer of 1863, which made supplying Southern civilians and armies difficult at best. At times, soldiers and civilians had to supply themselves, such as by personal payments or promise of payment in the future for food, for example. This was because they couldn't rely on their own government to handle the chaos of transportation as the war dragged on. The central government was often busy trying to organize the war effort with resistance from their own states, let alone northern armies. Each state was essentially responsible for supplying their own regiments. This often led to quarrels between southern states as each one tried to hoard materials for their own troops and not wanting to share them with soldiers from another state. Uniforms, ammunition, food, and more were left in warehouses instead of going to the armies, partially as a result of these interstate quarrels, along with the degrading transportation situation. Appeals to the states to work together for the war by President Davis and others from the central government often fell on deaf ears, as many southern governors hated Davis and saw him as a tyrant, no better than Lincoln. These pressures were compounded by the lack of food in the South. In 1862, horrendous flooding in the spring destroyed almost 1/6 of the South's wheat crops and numerous other edible produce. Much of the crops that did survive then died in a sweltering drought that summer that eventually lasted for 2 years. A good portion of the food that was available ended up rotting in warehouses as shipping became a nightmare with federal invasions and blockades. Food riots broke out in Richmond and other cities, and thousands of soldiers, reading letters from their starving families, left Southern armies by the hundreds in order to try to help them. Dwindling supplies and raw materials also made it difficult for many factories to adequately supply armies and citizens with their growing demands. Many closed and were eventually commandeered or outright destroyed by federal forces. Supplies and food became bartering items as the financial situation in the South also crumbled over the course of the conflict. When the Confederate government formed, it soon ran into financial problems that the Founding Fathers encountered under the original Articles of Confederation. With low supplies of coins and bullion, money was created using paper banknotes, similar to what we find in our wallets today. While paper notes were nothing new, both sides in the conflict would normalize the use of paper bills that were printed by the central government as currency. Some coins were minted by the Confederacy, but it was largely deemed a process that could wait until after the war. Paper notes were far easier for the situation that they were in, but this was easier said than done. The Confederacy did not have a great assortment of minting tools, as most were located in the North. This meant currency supply had to be handled by multiple entities. The central government, as well as individual states and even some individual banks, in the later years began to create Confederate banknotes. There would eventually be over 70 different designs during the course of the war. State banks creating notes was something normal before the war, but the lack of universal tools proved troublesome. Because of the large variety, there was a real problem with counterfeiting. Northerners and Southerners alike tried to get as many goods and resources as they could with money that they created. With the standard changing all the time, there was very few ways to be sure if a merchant was receiving a fake or just a new design from the government. Ironically, counterfeit graybacks from the time period are just as valuable and popular today as legitimate graybacks among collectors. Confederate notes were mostly fiat, meaning that they were not backed by any financial asset, like gold for example. The same practice with the US dollar today. This meant that the Confederate government could print as much as needed to pay debts and purchase goods, which is not always a good situation to have. In 1861, the Confederate dollar, known as the grayback, was roughly worth 90 cents to the US dollar, which was consequently named the greenback. But by 1865, the grayback value had dropped to 3 cents, or lower in some areas, and people barely used them in transactions. This was due to inflation. Inflation is when there is a drastic increase in the currency supply and everyone has more money, but they are all looking to buy the same limited resources, which means prices will rise to balance things out. Basically, the higher the supply of something, the less valuable it is because, well, it's everywhere. Inflation rates held steady for the first 2 years, with slight increases as time went on. The South tried to fix its lack of bullion and inflation rates, as well as gain some open seaports that were free from Union blockade with the New Mexico campaign, which I'll cover in another video. The campaign ultimately failed, but confidence was still high with Southern success on the eastern battlefields. Inflation even began to drop a little by the winter of 1862 as confidence grew. But then 1863 happened. Vicksburg on the Mississippi was placed under siege and eventually fell, cutting the Western Confederacy off from the east. Also, Lee's gamble at Gettysburg failed. As donations and investors stopped giving money because of this, the government was forced to take on the full financial burden on its own. Its solution was to print more money to deal with the debts. Inflation soared. Some individual states tried to stem the inflation problem by their own means. Mississippi created a cotton standard for their currency, but cotton embargoes, the Union blockade, and the loss of control of the Mississippi took away any of its effectiveness. Florida tried to do the same with public lands, but this was more complicated and was more in theory than actually practiced. But most people in the Confederacy began to use precious metals, bartered goods, or even used the more secure federal greenback for transactions by the winter of 1863. Some Confederate bills were even supposed to collect interest, like a savings account or bond, but this would also become complicated to figure out by the end of the war, and many would not be honored as inflation raged out of control. A gold standard was eventually proposed for the grayback to help with transactions with foreign investors, but this was never put into practice, probably due to the lack of gold in the government's possession. Fiat was here to stay in the Confederacy. Reaching 700% by March of 1864, inflation rates finally began to decline as the Confederate Congress threw out an anchor in the form of the Currency Reform Act of 1864, which cut the supply of all Confederate currency by 1/3. The hope that Lincoln would lose his re-election to McClellan, meaning that the war might come to an end with the South somewhat still intact, also played a part. But this was short-lived. A few months later, in August, the slow, bloody drive to Richmond by General Grant, and the terrible Confederate losses at Atlanta against General Sherman, forced the government to start printing again. By February 1865, after the re-election of Lincoln, with Savannah being taken by Sherman, Hood's army essentially destroyed at Nashville, and the loss of Fort Fisher that defended Wilmington, North Carolina, the last open eastern seaport of the South, inflation grew to incredible levels, estimated between 5,000 to 9,000% from its original value. But honestly, no one was using the bills at this point. Other than raiding federal institutions, the South tried more sustainable means to raise financial capital. It needed to raise money for the ongoing war effort, and needed the support from its civilians to do that. Early on in the war, donations and contributions from well-off individuals, along with seizures of federal stores and banks, were used. But these only supplied the effort for half of 1861. In fact, very little taxes were taken, because most believed that the war would be over soon and more taxes weren't needed. But as expenses grew by 1862, most people stopped donating to the cause, and began hoarding gold and silver to protect themselves from the growing effects of inflation. The Confederate government resorted to taxes and tariffs. A war tax was agreed upon by the southern states to impose fees on luxury goods and all property over $500. However, many southern families either had donated already to the war effort, were too much in debt to take the collection seriously, or in a dress rehearsal for Sherman's march years later, Southerners tried to hide their wealth from Confederate tax collectors. Many of the rich individuals who this tax targeted were also either fighting in the war, or used connections that they had to get out of the tax. Needless to say, it was difficult to collect, and the war tax only accounted for about 5% of the revenue of the government, rather than the expected 20 or 25%. In 1863, the Congress passed a tax-in-kind bill, basically getting medieval by collecting 1/10 of all agricultural goods and crops based on state output, with a good portion of the supply going to Confederate soldiers. This was more successful and accounted for nearly half of the government revenue by the end of the war. Loans were another means to raise capital. The South advertised various loans and stocks to foreign investors, especially in Europe, making 20% of the government revenue. Cotton bonds were also sold, and were extremely popular with the British. Basically, the bond was backed by cotton and listed at bale prices, similar to an ETF today. Purchasers could exchange them for actual cotton bales, interest included, but had to pick them up themselves through the blockade. Needless to say, prices did go up on cotton, and there were some mad lads who ran the blockade to collect their due. The Confederacy did honor most of these bonds, and they were quite successful. Yet, after the fall of Atlanta, the foreign realization that there was no chance at all anymore of the South making a comeback or even existing through a peace settlement drove prices down as investors tried to unload the bonds as quickly as possible to anyone willing to buy. Another type was unbacked loans, or loans with no financial asset behind it. A few of these were taken out at various amounts, riding the confidence gained from Southern battlefield success early on in the war. But as the conflict dragged on and battlefield losses increased, the Southern economy tanked. The government defaulted on paying back most of its creditors in this instance. Raids, unofficial donations, and commandeered goods made up an untold amount of the Confederate expenditures, but by the end of the conflict, raising capital was virtually impossible, and the Southern economy fractured into numerous local economies, concerned with just surviving until peace came again. Finally, trade. Trade made up a surprisingly small part of the Confederate economy. Most international trade was done before the federal blockade was locked in place. The federal ships, once fully surrounding all Confederate ports by July of 1861, however, did not allow much to get into the South, even with blockade runners. With cotton the main export, a cotton embargo was done in an effort to choke international cotton supply and bring France and Britain into the war to free up the South for exportation again. However, British and French colonies, and a few other international suppliers, stepped up production, filling the void and effectively making the embargo useless. With ample cotton supply, the British and French governments were totally fine sitting this conflict out, and leaving the South's hope for foreign intervention at just that, a hope. Total trade shrank to just 5% of its pre-war numbers by the end, and only accounted for around 12% of the government's expenditures, and mostly this was at the beginning of the war. The South won many battles early on in the conflict and came very close a number of times to winning a political victory, and even threatening Washington, D.C. a few times. But this would have been the only path to victory for the South, as all the cards laid with the North. Looking at the economics of the South, it is perplexing how the Confederate government and army even lasted as long as it did. Estimates say that the Confederacy spent nearly $2 to $3 billion for the war effort, or practically all of its wealth, near $35 billion today, for such a small window of victory. It might have been even why Lee tried to end the war twice by taking it up north to secure a victory through a military checkmate of sorts. He and many others knew that there was no chance for the South the longer the conflict went on, and that the South was nowhere near matching the industrial and military output of the Union. And even if the Confederacy had won the war, financial collapse would have still happened due to the built-up pressures of the conflict. Perhaps a new civil war would have broken out in the South among the new Confederate States of America over resources. Who knows? While we often hear of the successes on the battlefield for the South, the picture we see of the home front, behind the lines, is one of a slow descent into devastation. Victory for the South counted on it being a quick victory, while supplies and finances held out. But as we'll see, speed was not achievable, as I'll go over the economy of the North next month. Thank you for watching, and please share this video with others to help spread the joy of learning. Subscribe for more, please like the video, and please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. I'm Eric the Lone Pine Wolfman, and remember, never stop learning.